We're on Daf Yomi today. We were learning yesterday about the concept of malacha shein and tzricha legufa, and we ran over it very, very quickly. But the basic principle is that when a person does a malacha with a certain instrument and he uses it with the objective, or he performs the malacha, he performs the act with an objective that is different from the objective that was originally done in the Mishkan in the course of that action, so that's called the malacha shein and tzricha legufa. Here the Zav is wearing this cup and is carrying it outside not to collect things in it, but rather to protect his clothing. And as a result, Reb Shimon says that you're not liable for doing a malacha on Shabbos. This is Rabbanan, but you haven't done a malacha. We're going to have to revisit this topic later on, but we have to go weiter. So we're up to the words Tani Devei Rabbi Yishmael. It's about 8 or 9 lines from the top. The Brisa states as follows. We know that the Mishnah was discussing the topic of the prohibition of walking outside on Erev Shabbos with items that you may end up carrying on Shabbos. So the Brisa says that Yotzei Adam b'tefillin be'erev Shabbos im chashecha, that what you are allowed to do is you're allowed to walk around with your tefillin on Erev Shabbos all the way up until lich benching, and you don't have to worry that you're going to forget it and inadvertently carry it on Shabbos. My taima, kevin da Amar Rabba bar Avhuna chayv adam l'mashmesh b'tefillin kol sha'a b'sha'a kal v'chomer mitzitz. Because Rabbi bar Avhuna is of the opinion that a person has an obligation to be constantly mindful and always touch his tefillin constantly. And we learn this from a kal v'chomer from the tzitz, which is the forehead plate that the Kohen Gadol wore. Mat tzitz shein bo el azkara echas amar Torah v'haya al mitzcho tamid shlo yasich daitu mimenu. The forehead plate only had Hashem's name written on it once, the Yud Kei Vav Kei. And yet the Torah says that it has to be on his forehead eternally or constantly. And what the word tamid implies is that he has to be constantly aware of the fact that he has God's name on his person, on his body. So then tefillin sheish bahin azkaros harbe alach haskama v'kama. Then surely when you're wearing the tefillin, you have to be constantly mindful, because the tefillin has multiple times where God's name is written. So a person has to be constantly in a state of awareness that he's wearing the tefillin, and therefore hilkach midkar dachir lahu. And therefore the tefillin, the awareness that you have with the wearing of the tefillin, will remind you that, listen, I got to take this off before Shabbos. Tanya Chananya Omer Chayiv Adam Lamashmesh Begadav Erev Shabbos im chashecha. Now we say this every Friday night in the Bamedla Madlikin. It's a further discussion of the obligation to prepare properly on Erev Shabbos for Shabbos to make sure that you don't end up carrying. And what do? You got to check your clothes. You got to check your pockets, make sure there's nothing in your pockets. Amar Rav Yoseph Hilchas Rabbi l'Shabbos. That this is a very important halacha on Shabbos. Rashi says if you observe this and you check your pockets before Shabbos, you'll be protected from possibly violating Shabbos, because your clothing will be properly checked. I know that they say the story about the Stipler Gaon, that his big day Shabbos, he would never put anything in his pockets. In like when Shabbos was over, he refused to sell his Sfarim until he changed from his big day Shabbos into his big day Chol, because he didn't want to ever inadvertently put a pen or a coin in his Shabbos clothing, lest sometime down the road he would get stuck and find something in his pocket on Shabbos. Okay, lo yafles kelev chule. Now, in order to appreciate the next piece of Gemara, we have to carefully read the words of the Mishnah. The Mishnah had told us 2 halachos back to back. The first halacha was lo yafle es kelev. A person should not remove lice from his clothing on Shabbos. I originally thought that mevayer was to heat your clothing. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means to remove lice. You would flick them off or pick them off your garments. And you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. And the next thing that the Mishnah had said, v'lo yikra la'or haner, nor are you allowed to read by the light of a candle. Now, we could read those 2 halachas in one of 2 ways. One with a comma and one without a comma. You could read it as lo yafles kela v'lo yikra la'or haner, that you should not remove lice or read by the light of a candle, which means that both of them are usher by candlelight, they're only usher by candlelight. Or halacha number 1 is completely ends with a comma. You should not remove lice, period, or comma. nor should you read by the light of a candle. Okay, so because of this ambiguity, we're now going to clarify the ambiguity.
Why would you ever pick lice out of your thing only by a candle?
So let's see. It could be that we're talking only at nighttime, and the problem is, whatever problem is by reading would be the problem by lice as well. But maybe during the daytime, there's no problem of removing lice. It's only a problem at night when it's done by candlelight. So iboyaluhu lo yaflis kelev biyom shema yaharog v'Rabbi Eliezer he. So the first possibility is that it's forbidden to remove lice even during the daytime, right? And the reason is because of Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanya Amar Rabbi Eliezer hahori kina b'Shabbos ki lohori gamal. That according to Rabbi Eliezer, killing a louse on Shabbos is the same as killing a camel. In other words, it's a living creature, and you're not one of the malachas of Shabbos prohibits you from killing a living creature on Shabbos, and therefore it's a separate halacha. And the next halacha is below yikra or haner shema yateh. You're not allowed to read by the light of a candle, lest you come to tilt the candle and do the malacha of havara. Odilma to ravayu shema yateh. Or maybe there's no prohibition of killing a louse on Shabbos, and the whole prohibition is only checking for lice at night, lest you come to tilt the candle in your examination of your clothing. So Toshma, ein polin ve'ein korin la'or haner. So Lebraisa says you're not allowed to remove lice or read by the light of a candle. So the Gemara says mi alima mi masnisa. That's Braisa's language is just as ambiguous as our Mishnah, because you could read it with a comma or without a comma. You could read it as don't remove lice, comma, and don't read by the light of a candle. Or you can read it as don't remove lice and don't read by the light of a candle. So you have any better indication from the Brisa that you do from the Mishnah. So Tashma, listen to this Brisa. Ein polin la'or haner, ve'ein korin la'or haner. That here it says explicitly, you may not remove lice by the light of a candle, nor may you read by the light of a candle. And elu min ha'alachos shamru ba'aliyas Chananya ben Chizkiya ben Gara. And these two halachos were stated in the attic of Chananya ben Chizkiya ben Garon, which we'll learn about a little bit later on. So anyway, Shma Mina, the Teravayu Shemayata Shma Mina. So you see that really there is no prohibition of killing a louse on Shabbos. There's only a problem of examining your clothing by the light of a candle, lest you come to tilt. We're going to learn why momentarily. Rashi, but I'll just foreshadow it. Rashi tells us that the reason why there's no prohibition of killing lice on Shabbos is because, as we all know, lice do not reproduce in the same way that other insects or animals do. Lice are produced spontaneously by perspiration. And of course, we all know that. All right, so of course this becomes part of a much larger discussion, the issue of scientific knowledge in the times of Chazal. It's a much bigger discussion than we have time for today. But suffice it to say that human perception is such that it appears as if lice spawn spontaneously from perspiration. Halach is designed to address that which man perceives, but not necessarily that which is a scientific reality. And therefore Chazal said that you're allowed to kill lice on Shabbos because of our perception that they are not spawned in the same fashion as other insects or animals.
Does it apply now today still?
According to most poskim, it applies today as well. Once it's been codified in Shulchan Aruch, we do not change. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, afilu lahavchin ben bigdo levigdei ishto. So Rav Yehuda says now in the name of Shmuel that it's furthermore forbidden to inspect your wardrobe if you want to be able to pull out your clothes and distinguish them from your wife's clothing. That too you're not allowed to do by the light of a candle, lest you come to tilt. Now, you have to appreciate that men's clothes, so what are we worried about? That you're going to put on a dress? Right? Because if you don't examine, you'll pull out your wife's clothing and you'll wear her dress. What?
Don't worry about borer.
No, it's not borer. It's clear, they're separate, you're not necessarily being borer because they're distinct. The problem is that men's and women's clothing were very similar to each other in certain locales. Remember, men wore tunics back then. And so sometimes there would be very subtle differences between men's and women's clothing. And Amar Rava, lo amran ela de b'nei machuz, ela de b'nei chaklisa meida yadi. So Rava says, but that's only true if you're a city slicker, with the frilly, dainty things that the guys used to wear, right? Then it's hard to tell between the men's clothing and the women's clothing. But if you're living out on the farm, you know that the men's sleeves are much shorter and less frilly than the women's sleeves because you got to work out on the farm.
Thank you.
So therefore, it's very clear to see. And furthermore, even if you're a city slicker, we're only talking about the clothing of mature people because there it's not so frilly and fancy, neither the men's clothing or the women's clothing. But if you're dealing with little, girls' clothing, so then they've got the flared dresses and the frilly stuff and the really, pigtails and all that stuff. So the girls' clothing, you can immediately tell the difference between that and a boy's clothing. So therefore, you don't have to worry that you're going to tilt the candle to be able to distinguish. Tana Rabbana, Ein Polen b'rishus harabim pnei akava, that a person is not allowed to remove lice in a public venue because of kavod. What kavod are we talking about? People are going to be disgusted if they see you standing there in the middle of the street pulling lice off your garments. It looks gross. V'chayotze bo Amar Rabbi Yehuda v'Amilo Rabbi Nechemya ein osin apuktoizin b'rishus harabim pnei akavod. You're not allowed to vomit, cause yourself to vomit in rishus harabim. Now, what did they do? They used to either take a feather and tickle themselves in their throat, or they used to take a certain kind of what is it? Ipecac? What is that syrup? Ipecac, syrup of ipecac that we have today. You drink it and it makes you vomit, right? It's good when your kid swallows something that he shouldn't have swallowed. You give him that. But people used to do this. The Romans used to do this. They used to have the vomitorium or whatever they used to call it, right?
It's called
I forget what they called it, But they used to go. They would gorge themselves. No. They would gorge themselves on food.
What's it called? People, bulimia.
Right. No, that's the Romans used to gorge themselves, and then they would all go, instead of going to the urinal, they would go to the vomit pit, and they would all tickle their throats, and they would vomit, and then go back and sit down and eat more. That was their form of recreation. So the Gemara says you can't do this publicly. This is disgusting. Tana Rabbanan Hamafala.
Is that Jewish? The Jews indulge in something like that?
No, I'm saying it's the Romans used to do this. I'm saying the Gemara says this is not derech eretz. Tana Rabbanan Hamafalas Kelev Molol V'Zorekul Levad Shelo Yaharo. So the Brisa now says that if you're removing lice off of your garment, you can roll the louse in your fingers and then you could flick it, but you shouldn't kill it. Now the reason you'd roll it is you want to get it a little dizzy before you flick it, so that it won't fly back and latch it back onto your clothing. This is serious,
really?
Right? Yeah, that was the reason. Abashol Omer notil v'zarikul v'vad shelo yimlo. And Abashol disagrees, because Abashol holds that killing a louse on Shabbos is a malacha. So therefore he says that you can't even roll it in your fingers before you flick it, because lest you may come to kill it when you're rolling it. And Amar Rav Huna halacha molol v'zorek v'sehu kevodo ba'afilu b'chol. And Rav Huna says, I hold that you can both roll it and you can flick it, and because I'm not worried about killing the lice, nor he may hold that it's only Nissa D'Rabbanan to kill lice on Shabbos, but it's certainly not a malacha. And he says, and that's considered to be your honor, and you can therefore do this even during the weekday. And I believe he's saying even publicly you can go ahead and do this. Why? Because even though other people may be grossed out by it, but the fact is, you need kavod as well, that you shouldn't have to walk around with itchy, scratchy, pesty lice walking around on your garment. So Rabbi Mekateyalahu, Rabbi used to kill lice on Shabbos, this is the way Rashi learns. Rav Sheshis Mekateyalahu, and Rav Sheshis did as well. Rava Shadilahu Lakana Demaya. Rava, however, would not kill them outright, but he would flick them into a pail of water. Amar Lahu, Rav Nachman Lebinte, Katilin Vashminin Likala de Sanvasi. He says, it seems like Rav Nachman got a thrill. He told his daughters, when he killed the lice, he says, I kill them, and it sounds like to me that I'm hearing the voice of my enemies. Help me! Right? Like he would kill them, like, and he would get like that thrill of getting rid of his enemies. Right? What movie was that from, by the way? The Fly. Thank you. Not Jeff Goldblum. The original one. Come on, where's your bikis? Tanya, Rav Shimon ben Elazar Omer. Rav Shimon ben Elazar says, "Ein harginas hamacholos b'Shabbos divrei Beis Shammai." You're not allowed to kill a louse on Shabbos. That's according to Beis Shammai, but Beis Hillel matirin. But Beis Hillel say it's mutter. Because they hold Like I learned before, they hold that it's not spawned in the normative fashion. They're not porin v'ravin. They don't spawn in the way that normal animals do. V'chein hoyer Rav Shimon ben Elazar omer mishum Rav Shimon Gamliel ein mishadchen es atinokos la'ares v'lo es atinok l'lamdo sefer. That Rav Shimon ben Gamliel said that because he was a Talmud of Beis Shammai, he said that you're not allowed to make shiduchim on Shabbos. You're not to make engagements, nor are you allowed to engage the services of a tutor to teach your child Torah on Shabbos, nor are you allowed to engage someone to apprentice your child to teach him a trade on Shabbos. Ve'ein menachem im avelim, nor are you allowed to do nichum avelim, ve'ein mevakim cholim, or visit the sick on Shabbos. That's all according to Divrei Beis Shammai. It's all according to Beis Shammai. U'Beis Hillel matirin, but Beis Hillel say it's perfect. All of these things are fine. Why? So there's the pasuk in the Navi says that there's a prohibition of engaging in any kind of business affair on Shabbos. But if it's a business affair for a mitzvah, they still hold that it's mutter. And therefore, the first items on the list, to make a shidduch, to hire someone to teach Torah or to teach a trade, these are all mitzvahs. And therefore, we say this in the Zmiris, right? V'sinok l'lamde sefer u'l'sharei chabanos, right? Or as we in the what's the lihisanek b'sanugim, right? We say that you're allowed to do these things because they're involved in a mitzvah. Bikr cholam anicham avelim. The reason Beis Shammai said you shouldn't do it is because it's sorrowful. But Beis Hillel says, well, wait a minute. If it's sorrowful, but it's in the course of doing a mitzvah, then you're allowed to do it. By the way, we paskin that way. You can visit the sick on Shabbos, and you can even do nicham avelim on Shabbos. It's a misconception that people have that you can't be menachem avel on Shabbos. It's not true. Yes, right. We think that you're not supposed to, but you're allowed to. Now, as we'll see later on, it's less than optimal because you're not supposed to engage in sorrowful activity if you can avoid it. But also realize that if you detect that the person could use some company, then there is a mitzvah of nicham avelim on Shabbos. We do that before Shabbos, just as Shabbos is coming in. Right. Tana Rabbana. Hanechnas levaker es achoyle omer Shabbos imi lizok u'refuah karavolavo. The Brisa says that when you enter to be mavaker achoyle on Shabbos, you say what we say in the Mishberach. You say that Shabbos is not a time for crying, and the refuah should come quickly. But Reb Meir Omer, Yecholi Hisha Terachim, Reb Meir said it even further. He says if you properly observe Shabbos and you have the sense of relaxation and menucha, then the Shabbos is therapeutic. It will help heal you. Reb Yehuda Omer, Hamakom Yerachem Alecha ve'al Chole Yisrael. Reb Yehuda says you're supposed to say, may the omnipresent one have compassion upon you and on all of the sick of Israel. And Reb Yossi Omer, Hamakom Yerachem Alecha b'so Chole Yisrael. He says, say even better. Say that Hashem should have compassion upon you amidst the sick of Israel. Why? So we'll see in just a minute why that's more important. So Shavni Yishrushalayim b'chenisasa omer shalom u'v'yitziyasa omer Shabbosim ilizak u'refuah karavolavo b'rachavav v'merubin b'shabbato b'shalom. So he used to say, when he would come into the room to visit the sick, he would say shalom. Not just to say howdy. That wasn't the shalom. Shalom was peace. There should be peace and harmony in your life. And when he would leave, he would say, Shabbos is not a time for crying out. The refuah should come quickly, and Hashem's mercy is abundant. And v'shabbat b'shalom, and his Shabbos is a time for peace. And therefore, we want to remind you that there should be peace and harmony in your life, even if you're fulfilled with sadness because of your sickness. Now, Kaman Azla Hadamar Rabbi Chanina Mishiyesh Lechola B'Soch Beis Tzach Shi'arvena B'Soch Chola Yisrael. Rabbi Chanina used to say that if there's a sick person in your house, you have to include him, mix him in with all of the other cholam in Yisrael. Kaman Ka Rabbi Yossi. It looks like Rabbi Yossi that we saw before. The reason is you say B'Soch Shar Chola Yisrael amidst the other sick of Israel is because the zechus of the rabbim, the merits of the community, will come to the aid of the individual. Don't single out the individual, but rather, and that's what we do when we daven in Rifa'enu, when we say our private petition, may you please send a refuah shalema to the following individuals. We enumerate their names, and then at the end we say B'Soch Sha'ar Cholei Yisrael, amidst the other sick of Israel.
I thought that when there's a chola in the midst of the shul, you don't mention his name on the chola lesson.
Why not? I don't know. That doesn't. I never heard that before.
What is the merit? The zechut is from the other cholim that we're asking.
Right, because when you include someone among a community of people, then you're not singling them out. You're actually, they are reinforced and strengthened through being part of a larger number, a larger community of the sick. V'amar Rabbi Chanina b'koshi hitir l'nachem avelim l'vakar chol b'Shabbos. Rabbi Chanina also said that it was only with difficulty that the rabbis permitted us to do these sorrowful activities, but they're mitzvahs, to do nicham avelim and to do bikra cholim. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana ki havazlinan basrei de Rebbe Elazar l'shiulei b'tficha, that when I would follow Rebbe Elazar to visit the sick, Zimnin Amar Hamakom Yifka Decha Shalom. Sometimes he would speak in Hebrew and he would say, "May the omnipresent one visit you in peace." Bezimnin Amar Rachmana Yad Karinach L'Shlam. And other times he would say the same thing in Aramaic. And he would say, "May the merciful one remember you in peace." But he would say it in Aramaic. So the Gemara asks, "Heichi Yavidachi," how could he do that? The Ha'amar Rav Yehuda La'olam al Yishal Adam Srachav B'Lashon Arami, that a person is not allowed to petition Hashem in Aramaic. V'amar Rav Yechanan Kol Hashel Srachav B'Lashon Arami Ein Malachi Asheres Nizkakin Lo Shem Malachi Asheres Makin B'Lashon Arami. And furthermore, Rabbi Yochanan said that if you do petition Hashem in Aramaic, the angels will not bring your prayer up to Shemayim, up to Hashem, because the angels don't understand Aramaic. Now, there's a tremendous amount of material that needs to be prefaced in order to understand this Gemara, which we don't have time for, quite frankly. But let me just tell you a brief sketch, okay, of what's going on over here. First of all, we are told that when you pray, the angels transport your prayer up to heaven, and that the prayers are therefore presented to Hashem by angels. But that's only true when you're davening individually. But if you daven with a minyan, the Shekhinah comes down, and therefore you don't need angels to transport your prayers up. And as a result, that's why when we do pray in Aramaic, you'll notice it's only in a public setting. You Kumpurkan and Baruch Shemay, so forth, it only can be in a public setting. Because there, the Shekhinah is present, you don't need angels to transport your prayer. But if you need angels to transport your prayer, don't pray in Aramaic. Why? Because angels don't understand Aramaic. Now, what does it mean they don't understand Aramaic? We have other midrashim that say that angels speak 70 languages, so why shouldn't they speak Aramaic? The Madana Yom Tov and other commentaries explain that what it means is that they don't like the Aramaic language because it represents an unappealing distortion of Lashon HaKodesh. It is a very Semitic, very close to Hebrew kind of language, and therefore they feel that it is a distortion of that which is truly holy, and therefore they don't want to have anything to do with it. And as a result, you're not allowed to use Aramaic if you need angels to bring your prayers to Hashem. So the Gemara's question is, well, what right did Rabbi Elazar have to pray for this chayla in Aramaic if he needs to rely on the angels to transport his prayers up? So the Gemara says, Shiny chayla de shechina imo. The answer is that a sick person is different because the angels are not needed to transport the prayer because the Shekhinah is right there with the Chayla, and therefore you can use Aramaic. It goes directly to Hashem. How do you know that the Shekhinah supports the sick person right there in his bed? As it says in the Pasuk in Tehillim that Hashem will support him on the bed of the weary or of the sickly. Tanya Namihachi Hanichmas Lavakars Hachoila Lo Yeshiv Al Gabi Mita Velo Al Gabi Kisei Elamis Ate V'Yoshev Lefanav V'Pnei Shechina Lamala Mirashos of Shalchoila. That a similar halacha is that when you go to visit the sick, according to Tosfos, he explains that you shouldn't sit on any surface, on a couch or a bed that is higher than where the chola's head is. And the reason is because the chola's head is covered or surrounded by the Shekhinah, so it's disrespectful to the Shekhinah if you're in a higher place than where the chola's head is.
Can I just ask? Can I assume that there's a lot more to the idea of angel? I mean,
yes, you can assume that, and that's
why. That's
why. No, take it literally, but you have to understand it. That's why I prefaced by saying that we don't have time to delve into this further. But you should definitely try and understand it better. Shenamar Hashem Yisadenu al Eretz Davoy, as it says in the pasuk that Hashem will support him on the bed of the sickly. How do you know, Rava said, that Hashem sustains and nourishes the sick? Shenamar Hashem Yisadenu al Eretz Davoy, using the very same pasuk. Next, v'lo yikra la'or haner. A person may not read by the light of a candle. Amar Rabba, afilu gavoa shtei kamos, v'afilu shtei mardeos, v'afilu asara batim zul gavzu. that basically Rabbi says the rabbis did not distinguish whether or not the candle is accessible to you or not, even if it's high up, even if it's like well beyond your reach, even if it's 10 floors above you. If you're reading by the light of that candle, what you're doing is you're violating a rabbinic precept. Because once the rabbis instituted the rule, they didn't distinguish between whether you could actually reach the candle or not. So then, of course, the question becomes, well, then what right do we have to read by the light of an incandescent bulb? And the answer seems to be, at least according to the vast majority of poskim, is that this halacha only applies to something which could be adjusted through movement of the light. But if you move the light and it doesn't affect the incandescence of the flame or of the filament inside the light bulb or the fluorescent bulb or the LED bulb, right? So then it's certainly not going to be a problem. So the Gemara now makes another diak and it says Chadu de lo likri hatre shapir dami. It seems from here that only one person is not allowed to read because we have to worry that he's going to forget at Shabbos and will tilt the candle. But if there are two people, it sounds like from the Mishnah that it's okay because one will remind the other. But isn't there a brisa that says even two people can't read? The answer is that it depends what kind of reading activity they're doing. If they're reading the same text together, then it's okay because each one will remind the other not to tilt the candle. But if each one is reading his own book or own scroll, then there's no way for one person to notice what the other guy is doing because they're both engrossed in their separate activities. Amar Rav Huna uvamedura afilu asara b'nei adam aser. If there's a bonfire, then even 10 people cannot sit by the light of that bonfire to read. And the reason is because even though we're sitting together, we're really not together because each one has his own individual part of the flame that he's reading by, so no one else is going to really see what he's doing. Amar Rava, im adam chashuv hu moter. Rava says that if the person is chashuv, if he's an important dignitary, like he's an aristocrat, so then he's allowed to read by the light of the flame. Rashi explains we're not dealing with a Talmud Chacham here. We're dealing with someone who's quite wealthy and distinguished because he's used to having his servants or his butler adjust the flame for him. He doesn't adjust the flame himself during the week, and therefore on Shabbos too, you don't have to worry that he's going to adjust the flame because that's beneath his dignity, and therefore it's permitted. So meisvei, so the challenge is lo yikra l'or haner shemayate. There's a brisa that says as follows: a person should not read by the light of a candle lest he come to tilt. And Amar Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha ani ekra v'lo ate. And Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha said, you know what? I appreciate what the rabbis had in mind, but I'll read and I'll make sure that I don't tilt the candle. Pamechas kara ubikesh lahatos. And one time he was reading on Shabbos and he was squinting to read the fine print, and he was about to tilt the candle and he caught himself. And he said, Omar, kam gedolim divrei chachamim sheyomrim lo yikra l'or haner. And he realized, he said, and now I really appreciate the tremendous wisdom of the chachamim who said that you shouldn't do this.
What with tilting exactly?
Tilting could actually increase the flame because you're...
Sure.
Yeah.
But that doesn't apply to the lamps that you have sitting on the table in the morning. Is that also?
A lamp? What kind of lamp are you talking about?
The light bulb.
Yes, that's what we just had that discussion. I said an incandescent bulb doesn't have this problem because no matter how you move it, right? There are poskim who say that you should not move a lamp on Shabbos. Actually, Rav Miller in Torornto had addressed this issue because the kosher lamp was invented here in Toronto. What is it called? Kosher lamp, right? And so the question was raised to Rav Miller. He says, yes, it's okay to move the cover. Are you allowed to actually move the entire lamp from one place to the other? Rav Miller holds that it's a machlokas aposkim, and roi lahachmir if possible, but if you want to be makel, you could also be makel, because again, there's no problem of shemayata in a situation like this. So Rav Nassan Omer, kara v'hita v'kasav alpin. So Rav Nassan Omer, kara v'hita v'kasav alpin kaso ani Yishmael ben Elisha karisi v'hitesi ner b'Shabbos l'chishi yivana beis hamikdash avichata shmeina. Rav Nassan says you got the story wrong. It's not that Rabbi Yishmael almost tilted; he actually did tilt the candle, and he wrote down on his notebook and he said, "I Yishmael ben Elisha." Did a malacha, I read and I tilted the candle on Shabbos, and when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, I will be obligated to bring, I hereby obligate myself to bring a korban chatas of a fatted animal to atone for my sin. So the Gemara's question is, You see from here that even though Rabbi Yishmael was an Adam Chashuv, he was an aristocrat, nevertheless it was still usher for him to tilt the candle. Why is that? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Abba, Shani Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, holu umesim atzmal divrei Torah kehedjot. The answer is that even though when it came to reading other documents, Rabbi Yishmael would never tilt candles, he would have his attendants do it, he was so excited to learn Torah that when it came to Torah study, he made himself like a commoner and would regularly tilt in order to be able to read the Torah words better. Tani chada shamash bode kosos ukaros lor haner, Tanya idach lo yivdok. So one brisa says that a butler, who's the attendant at a meal, is allowed to examine the cups and plates before the meal by the light of the candle on Shabbos to make sure that they're clean. And the other brisa says that he's not allowed to. So how do you reconcile it? Lo kasha kan b'shamash kavua, kan b'shamash she'eno kavua. Rashi explains is that if he's a shamash kavua, he's a regular employee, he's got a little bit more fear from his boss, because if his boss finds the plates to be dirty, he could lose his job. And therefore he's going to be really careful, and that's when it's usher for him to examine it by the light of the candle, because he might end up tilting the flame. But if it's a temp, a guy who's not a regular worker there, so then you don't have to worry that he's going to be so careful, because he doesn't really care about his employment, his job, and therefore he's not going to be so careful, and therefore it's okay for him to check by the light of the candle. The moral of the story is that if you go to a restaurant, ask the waiter how long he's been working there, right? Anyway, v'iboy, so that would be one answer. V'iboy yisema, another answer could be, ha v'ha b'shamash kavu v'lo kasha, ha b'demishcha, ha b'denatva. The other answer could be that it depends what kind of lantern or fuel source the candle is burning from. If it's burning from olive oil, so then there's a fear that he's going to tilt the candle. But if the fuel source is kerosene, kerosene gives off a foul odor. People don't like to be near it. And therefore, there's no fear that he's going to go up to the candle and tilt it, because people generally stay away from that. So the question now was raised, what if you have a temp employee who is dealing with an olive oil flame? So you have on one side, he's a temp, so you don't have to worry, but on the other side, it's olive oil, so maybe you do have to worry. So Amarav, halacha vein morin kain. Rav says the halacha is technically it's okay because he's just a temp, but don't publicize it because we don't want people to be mezalzel in the halacha. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar halacha umorin kain, and Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said no. Once you know that it's mutter, go ahead and let people go. If the guy's just a temp, it's not his regular place of employment, then it's perfectly fine for him to check the plates and the cups by the light of the candle. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba iklu lebei Ravasi, and the Gemara brings a story that Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, the fellow who said that it's okay to publicize it, he once went to visit Ravasi on Shabbos, and kam shame kabodik l'nahora d'shraga. And Rav Yirmiyah's butler started checking the plates and the cups to make sure that they were clean by the light of the candle. So Ravasi's wife said, hey, how can you, Ravasi, how can you permit Rav Yirmiyah's butler to do this? You don't permit our help to check the plates and the cups by the light of the candle. So Ravasi said, leave the butler alone. He holds like his Rabbi Yirmiyah, since this is not his regular place of employment, right? He's not going to get in trouble if the plates and cups are discovered to be dirty, and therefore he's not being so careful about checking the plates and the cups. If it was in Rabbi Yirmiyah's house, and the butler was checking, so then even Rabbi Yirmiyah would agree that it would be usher, because if Rabbi Yirmiyah would find the plates to be dirty, the guy would get into a lot of trouble. But over here it's our plates, so he's not going to get in trouble, so it's okay.
Butlers are Jewish.
These butlers are Jewish, yes. Hashamish, yeah. Be'emes amru hachazan chulei. The next part of the Mishnah had said that in truth the rabbi said that a chazan, which is we translated either as a gabbai or a malamed tinokos or a teacher of children, is allowed to check Friday night to see what to teach or what Torah reading to read the following day. But it says, but you're not allowed to read. So the Gemara is trying to clarify. So then what does it mean to look? If you're looking, well, then aren't you reading? So ha'amart reish roa, my lav likros. But you said you're allowed to look. So doesn't that mean you're allowed to read? So the Gemara says, lo, l'sader rashi parshiosa. No, it just means you're allowed to look at the first few words of every paragraph to know exactly where the aliyah begins or where you're supposed to start teaching the lesson for tomorrow. And because since you're the Gabbai and you're well versed in Torah knowledge, or you're the Malamed Tinokos, you're the Rebbe, you're the teacher, you'll know the rest of the paragraph by heart. It won't be necessary for you to read the entire paragraph. But to read an entire paragraph, you're not allowed to do. And the same thing was said by Rabbi Bar Shmuel, that you're allowed to just examine the opening first few words of each paragraph, but not read the entire paragraph. So Meisvei, the Gemara now challenges that. It says, Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer, Hatinoko shel beis Rabban hayu misajin parshios v'korin la'or haner. It says that the children on Friday night would look at the lesson plan that they had to read for the next day, and they would read by the light of the candle. So it says reading by the light of the candle. So how could that be? So Iboy Seima Rashi Parshios. So one answer could be that when it says read in that rice, it just means looking at the first few words to know where we're going to begin the lesson tomorrow, but not the entire paragraph. Another answer could be, says the Gemara, that when you're dealing with children who are in the presence of their Rebbe, there it is okay for them to read the entire paragraph by the light of the candle, because since their Rebbe is there, they're going to be mindful and sort of reverent, and therefore you don't have to worry that they're going to tilt because they know that their Rebbe is watching over them. Look at how times have changed, right? Anyway, have a wonderful day, everybody.